talking about saturated, subcooled, and superheat. Saturated, the temperature a fluid will phase change from a liquid to vapor or vapor to a liquid. So when I say saturated, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? PSIG converted to temperature. That's the first thing. Kind of a trick because the words didn't match it. When I'm saying saturated temperature, PSIG converted to temperature. When I'm saying pressure, saturated temperature. So that's the most important thing. Saturated is probably the most beautiful word in HVAC. It means so many things. It's the most overlooked. We're going to have subcooling. Refers to a liquid at temperature below saturation. I'm going to go into more detail in a minute. And superheat always refers to a vapor. Superheated vapor is any vapor above its saturation point for a given pressure. And saturated. Saturated means PSIG converted to temperature. Also means where there's liquid and vapor together. Where do we have liquid and vapor together? Condenser, that'd be liquid saturated. Do we have another saturated? Evaporator, suction saturated. Now, is there any other place that we deal with saturated?
Metering device.
Oh, it's good, because after the metering device it is saturated, so that's a good one. Not what I was looking for, but that's a great answer. Could deny that. What about, they had the tanks, right? You keep your tanks to your truck? Tanks? Is there a liquid and vapor in that tank?
Oh, in the cylinder.
In the cylinder, yes. If there's liquid and vapor in that tank, there has to be both. If there's liquid and vapor, what's it going to be? Saturated. PSIG converted temperature. It's also change of state, returns from a liquid to vapor, vapor to liquid. It's also latent heat. It's one word that means all these great things. Liquid and vapor in contact with each other at equilibrium, pressure and temperature tied together. That's where that PT chart's going to come into place. That's where it's going to come in. For this example, we have 290 PSI gauge. Is that number going to be relevant to me? No. So we're going to convert that to a saturated temperature, and we got 404A converted to a saturated exempt temperature. What does that come out to? 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Our actual line temperature is what? 115 degrees Fahrenheit. So what are we at? Saturated, liquid and vapor. Liquid and vapor together. We're at saturated. Do we want it to be at saturated coming out of that condensing coil? No. We need liquid. We need liquid coming out of it. So if we're at saturated, so if it's saturated here and we're also saturated here in the actual line, that means there's liquid and vapor. I don't have any liquid. This temperature should be lower than my saturated temperature. We need to subcool it. Can you drink a subcooled liquid?
Yeah, sure.
Good. Let's give an example. 718, R718 right here. What's the saturated temperature? 0 PSI gauge. What's the saturated temperature of this water? The vaporization saturation.
212.
212, yes, 212. The saturated temperature of this water is at 212. That's where it boils at. I have a temperature pressure chart that says this boils at 212 at the saturated temperature. What's the pressure in this room? Engage. Yeah, that's PSI, but in gauge it would be 0 PSI gauge, and it boils at 212. What's the temperature of the water in this room? What does that thermostat say? 69? Round it to 70, so I say 70 degrees. The actual temperature of the water in this room is at 70 degrees, but it boils at 212. What's 212 minus 70?
Like 180 something.
180, close enough. But you can see that it's subcooled below its saturation point. Is it at 212? No, it's subcooled below that. So we can only drink a subcooled liquid. So it's going to be saturated in the condensing coil, saturated in the evaporator coil. Now let's talk about superheated vapor. Here we have our pressure gauge hooked up to the line, and our line temperature, 43. Now here we got 74 PSI gauge. Do I want that number? If you call me and say, hey, Ty, I got 74 PSI gauge, what am I going to do? Probably going to hang up on you, no offense. I got things I got to do. I got classes to teach. 74 PSI gauge, 404A. That converts to a saturated temperature of 33. The actual line temperature is at what? 43. So if it boils from a liquid to vapor at 33, can we heat it up above 33 and have it still be a vapor?
Yeah.
Now it's sensible heat. 33, 34, 35, all the way up to 43. What's the difference between 43 and 33? 10. So it's superheated 10 degrees. Can you breathe a superheated vapor?
Sure. That's the only type you can.
It's the only type that you can breathe. You can only breathe a superheated vapor. Yes! Let's give you an example. Somebody's got to get their phone ready. You're going to have to Google this. I got my camera and I can't Google this. So what is the boiling temperature of oxygen?
Like negative, I forget, 140 something.
Somebody look it up real quick. We'll just do a Siri or a Google or a whatever popular today. That's the boiling temperature of oxygen. Minus 297. That's at saturation temperature. At 0 psi gauge, the saturation temperature is minus what? 297.3. Is the temperature of this room at that? But if the temperature was, it'd be at liquid and vapor. Or if it was below that, it'd be liquid. The temperature of this room was at 70. So what? 70 minus 297, which we add them together. So we're breathing oxygen. It is superheated, something degrees above its saturation temperature. We know what it changes state at, minus 200 and something, and its actual temperature is going to be much higher than that. So we know we're breathing in superheated vapor. What happens if you breathe in liquid oxygen? You're probably it's going to freeze in your throat, right? You're going to drown. It's not going to be good. But we also breathe what else? What's the other thing that we breathe? Nitrogen. What's the boiling point of nitrogen at 0 psi gauge? Minus 320.4. Let's go to 320. So what's 70 minus 320.4?
390.
You're breathing nitrogen. It's superheated nitrogen. Superheated. Its boiling point is way lower, but we're breathing as a superheated vapor. This compressor can only breathe a superheated vapor. So when we talk about that pressure converts to temperature, that's in the evaporator coil. But this line temperature should always be lower. Should be below saturation. What happens when we're below saturation? Liquids. Do we want it to be below saturation on the suction line coming to the compressor? No, because it's going to be a liquid to our vapor pump. It's going to kill it. What's another option? Higher. We want it to always be higher. If the line temperature is higher than the suction saturated, it's going to be a superheated vapor. And if I know that I have superheated vapor to my vapor pump, that's a good thing. What if I'm below? What if that temperature is below? It's going to be a liquid, which is really impossible to happen because of the science. But what happens if my suction line temperature and my saturated temperature is the same number? You're at saturation, which means there's liquid and vapor together. We don't know how much. Maybe there's only one drop. Maybe it's 99% full. We don't know, but we know there's liquid and vapor. What's going to happen to our vapor pump? Bam! Done. It's over. End of the day. We're going to be having to replace it with another one doing the same exact thing, and then another one doing the same thing, and another one doing the same thing. The refrigeration cycle is so important because I need to know that I have superheated vapor coming to the pump. If I don't have superheated vapor coming to the pump, it's not the pump, but it will kill it. We need to look back. Maybe it's an airflow problem with the evaporator coil. Maybe it's my metering device. Maybe it's, but it's something we need to look for. The refrigeration cycle.
Put 17 pounds of charge in a 7-pound system.
That happens all the time. And what? And how does that happen? Because people get hung up on pressures. Back in my day, we had R12 and we had R22 and we had carrying 500. It was very simple. You could memorize it. You could get pretty close. You could kind of get a feel for it. Anybody ever drove a car without a speedometer? Oh, it's horrible. But eventually you get used to it. Like, yeah, you kind of know what your speed you're going. But now tell this person how to drive your car without a speedometer.
Don't get pulled over.
But what if we actually had a speed limit sign and a speedometer, and we could get them where they match? Superheat is telling us how fast or how much vapor is coming back to this compressor. It's measuring superheated vapor. Let me put it to you this way. Is this glass half empty or half full? Yes, it is full. We're refrigeration technicians. It's 50% liquid, 50% vapor.
It's saturated.
It's saturation. But we want it to be 100% vapor coming back to our vapor pump. We want it to be full vapor. It needs to breathe the vapor. And I harp on this so much because I want you to really appreciate it's not just all engineering numbers. It's how we can see what's happening to our compressor. We need to be able to say, I don't care about the pressure. I want to know, do we have superheated vapor and how much superheated vapor coming to our compressor? Now, if I wanted this much superheated vapor, right? But I actually have this much superheated vapor. That means I have more superheated vapor than what I need. What's going on in my evaporator coil? Starving. There's not enough liquid in it. I need to add more liquid to it. So if we add a refrigerant, what happens to our superheated vapor? It goes down. I can't see the liquid, but by measuring the vapor, I know how much liquid we have left. Now, what if I wanted this much superheated vapor, but I have that much superheated vapor? I'm flooded. There's too much liquid in the evaporator, or there's too much liquid coming back to the compressor. Either way, we have a problem where we're here, we don't have any superheat, not enough superheat. We're below 5 degrees of superheat. We're at a danger point of getting liquid, this liquid coming back to that compressor. Do we want that? No. No, we don't want that. Superheat and subcooling is everything about the system. All right, subcooling. Heat removed from a liquid that caused the temperature to drop below its saturation point. So I call the subcooling submarine. Anybody seen The Hunt for Red October? Sean Connery can't do his voice, 5-degree down bubble. Well, saturation's where the liquid and the air are together, where the actual submarine is below the saturation point. The submarine. I have a song that goes with this. PT chart does not apply with temperatures without a drop in pressure. So we got our 280 psi gauge, converts to a saturated temperature, 113. So we got 404A, 280 psi gauge, 113. My actual line temperature is lower than that. So 113 minus 107 is what? 6. It's 6 degrees subcooled below its saturation number. So if I want this much, this is the opposite. Now we're measuring liquid. Opposite of vapor is liquid. If I want this much liquid, but I only have this much liquid, what does that mean about our condensing coil? We're starved. Not necessarily for starved. We need more liquid in that condensing coil. With that bottom few rows, we need to stack some more liquid in there. So by adding refrigerant, our subcooling will go up. By taking refrigerant away, our subcooling will typically drop. Subcooling is easy because it's directly measuring liquid. Vapor is a little bit more difficult because we have to convert it from a vapor thought into a liquid thought because they're opposite of each other. So far, so good? Still with me? Haven't lost anybody? Hanging on barely? Okay. So from our condensing coil all the way to our expansion device should be a subcooled liquid. Where does everybody check their subcooling? Here, right? You hook it up right here. There's subcooling coming out of the liquid line. It's below the saturated temperature. What happens if we have a long line set? It's going through a very hot attic or a hot mechanical room. What happens? What's possibly happens before we get to our metering device? As I put heat back into the suction line, or the liquid line, if I add heat back to our liquid line, what does our liquid line temperature do? It starts to go up. My saturated is the same, but as my liquid line temperature gets warmer, it's possible for me to lose my subcooling before I get to my metering device. This is why I like to see a sight glass before that metering device so that I can see, do I have liquid coming to that TXV or not? I've had a lot of problems where I've had it, especially with these houses, 2-story houses, big attics, no ventilation, and that liquid line temperature. We lose our subcooling before we get to our metering device. We end up at a flash gas, liquid and vapor mixture before I get to our metering device. One of the things to look for. Then we end up at saturated, change of state from a liquid to vapor. Then we superheat it, that last little section. We have our superheated vapor coming to our compressor. Here we have our metering device. What kind of metering device is this? Thermostatic expansion valve. What I love about these is their job is to, assuming you have enough airflow, their job is to try to maintain the superheat. As long as you give it enough liquid, it will try to maintain superheat for you. You got to give it enough liquid. If I pay you enough money to do a job, will you do the job for me? If I don't pay you enough money, are you going to do the job for me? Probably not. So if we don't give this metering device enough liquid, it can't do superheat for me. Awesome metering device. It's actually measuring the actual suction line temperature. It's got a sampling hose over here. It's measuring the suction pressure. It's literally the TXV is measuring superheat. That's what it's doing. And if you keep the lines clean and you don't overheat this while you're brazing it, or overheat the sensing bulb while you're brazing it, they last a long time. I have a book from Willis Carrier, from the day from Willis Carrier, that's got an expansion valve in there. Like these new expansion valves, man, the technology's been around for a long time. Any questions on superheat subcooling? When you contact any tech support, anybody, have that superheat subcooling because it tells me a lot about what's happening in that system. And have your saturated temperatures ready. What's the difference between sensible and latent heat?
Well, you can feel.
Measurable. You can feel it. Good. What else?
Latent
Latent is change of temperature without, change in state without a change in temperature. Which is more powerful, latent heat or sensible heat? Good. Saturated, what is that going to be? Vapor and liquid. So saturated, is it going to be sensible or latent? Latent. It's going to be latent. In the condensing coil, the middle of the condensing coil, is that going to be sensible or latent? In the middle of the evaporator coil, sensible or latent? The actual liquid line in a properly operating system, the actual liquid line, sensible or latent? Sensible, because we subcool it below, we can measure it below saturation. What about the suction line in a properly operating system? Sensible, because we want to sense superheated vapor coming back to a compressor. What about the discharge line coming out of the compressor? Sensible, it's going to be superheated way above the saturated temperature. Good. Why should you purge a system with nitrogen?
Get oxygen out.
Get the oxygen out, get the contaminants out. You're also pushing a lot of that moisture out. You're able to physically push the humidity in the air out by doing that as well. What's the value of using a Micron gauge?
Only way to get back.
Dehydration prevents, acid, which prevents also copper plating, also non-condensables. What's some of the best practices when charging a system?
Weigh it.
No. What's that?
Weigh it.
Weigh it. That's right.
Dial it in.
Weigh it in. That's right. Weigh it in. And while it's running, what do? Throttle in little bitty bits. You can use those little charging devices if you like, but you want to throttle it. If you're going to use that charging device, still watch it, because I've seen people just open it up with that charging device, and all that charging device is a restricted orifice. That's it. So people open it up and it floods the compressor. And if we're working with a blended refrigerant, which is most refrigerants now, we got to charge it as a liquid to prevent the cool word starts with F. Fractionation. That's exactly right. Fractionation. And where should you find a saturated refrigerant in a system?
The coil.
Coils. Evaporator coil, suction saturated. Condensing coil, liquid saturated. What happens if you have saturated in your liquid line?
You're going to break the compressor.
Liquid line. Your metering device will not be able to meter. Regardless of what meter device is, it can't meter. It needs liquid refrigerant. Maybe you have not enough refrigerant in the system. Maybe you got a restriction. Maybe they put more than one filter dryers in there, but you got some kind of an issue. Now, what happens if I have saturated on my suction line?
That's pretty low.
That's going to be a dead compressor. Saturated is going to be flood back, liquid flood back to your compressor. We don't know how much liquid. We know it's going to be liquid to a vapor pump. That's where we're looking for a bad day. Okay? And if you get a negative superheat, it probably means you got one of the gauges hooked up wrong. It is possible to have a negative subcooling, but it's really not possible to have a negative superheat. So you can have zero superheat, which is bad, but it's really not possible to have a negative superheat. And how do you calculate superheat? I like to say it like this. It's the actual suction line temperature minus the suction saturated temperature, your dew point. Why would the saturated temperature, why should it be above the line temperature?
For superheat?
Oh, sorry, the other way. Why is the line temperature should be above the saturated temperature?
Because that means it's above saturation.
That's right, above saturation. We should boil it from a liquid to a vapor. It should be higher, a higher number than the saturation point. Questions on that? Right. Yes?
What's going to kill your compressor faster, an overcharge or an undercharge?
Over.
Well, it's a great question, but it depends on our metering device. If we have an overcharge of the TXV or an electronic expansion valve, it's more than likely to back it up on the condensing side, but those metering devices will try to maintain superheat for us. But if we have a fixed orifice, an overcharge will kill it faster because the fixed orifice can't regulate. It just lets it on through. It's like, come on, guys, come on through. And what happens is all that extra liquid comes back to the compressor. So it depends on the metering device, but airflow is a big one. Like airflow all the time. When somebody says, yeah, the airflow is good, I'm like, did you use a hanometer? Airflow is a big one. So it's there's so many things that can kill a compressor. We're going to go through those. It's a great question.